Welcome to the Epic Flight Academy's commercial pilot course. My name is Mike Thompson, and today we'll be going over the power off glide to a landing. Let's get started. Keys to success for this maneuver are: number one, complete your A squared, B squared, C squared checklist. Number two, keep that downwind leg in close, a half mile or so, and don't let the tailwind cause you to overextend your downwind leg. Number three, have the airplane properly configured in terms of gear, props, and flaps. However, number four, do not add gear or flaps too soon, causing you to come up short. Number five, when you make the turn to base leg, be sure to roll into a crab angle. Key number six, fly the airplane in a coordinated manner. Do not slip or skid. Number seven, do not attempt to stretch the final approach. If you need to add power, add it. Remember, do not turn a training emergency into an actual emergency. Key number eight, clear the engine as needed, but do not use the throttle to increase the glide distance, or you're defeating the purpose of practicing this maneuver. Key number nine, do not try to force the airplane onto the runway to avoid overshooting a spot. This may lead to bouncing and porpoising. No, not that kind of porpoising, this kind.
All right, come on, man.
Oh! Yes! I have!
Oh my God!
Oh!
Right rudder! Right rudder! Rudder!
Oh my God! I thought it was just something wrong.
Did you get that on tape?
References for this maneuver will not be how I do it or the way my instructor showed me way back when or any specific flight school's method, but rather the Airplane Flying Handbook 8083 3C. By the way, the Epic Flight Academy Standardization Manual follows the Airplane Flying Handbook 8083 3C. Now, to get started in the maneuver, please open the Airplane Flying Handbook to Chapter 9 on page 24 and understand the real and fundamental goal of practicing this maneuver, shown in paragraph 2. And that is the ability to estimate the distance that the airplane will glide to a landing in a power-off condition. Yes, this is the essential skill that Captain Sullenberger used in the famous Hudson River landing of U.S. Airways Flight 1549. When mastering this skill, work up to it in steps. Start early in your training as a student pilot and glide to landings from the base leg. Gradually, as more and more variables are introduced and mastered, start to practice from downwind and then from greater distances and higher altitudes. The goal should be to glide the airplane to the low key point opposite the point of landing, or to the base key point at an altitude and airspeed that you are accustomed to on base legs, so that you can establish and maintain a stabilized approach to reach the desired aiming point at an airspeed that results in a predictable, controlled float. Please reference page 9-24. And notice on page 9-25, it tells us that the basic procedure is to close the throttle at a key position, starting with the same energy, airspeed and altitude. This makes the maneuver more predictable, and this develops the pilot's skill more consistently. Now, make a note here. While spot landings and accurate touchdowns are very important and a great skill to develop, in an actual situation, a controlled landing with airspeed and descent rate under control is more important than landing on any particular spot out of control. As the Airplane Flying Handbook chapter on emergencies tells us, a landing under control on or off the field is by far preferable to a landing on the runway out of control. Now, with the power at idle or power off in an actual engine failure, we can still manage both airspeed and altitude. This means that the key to a power off approach is energy management. We do this with our energy exchanger, otherwise known as the elevator. Please see our commercial course video titled Energy Management. The Airplane Flying Handbook explains this idea at the bottom of page 9-24 by referencing gliding airspeeds both above and below VG. So, VG is critical here? Why is that? Well, let's review. At the VG airspeed, the airplane will glide the farthest distance because at this airspeed, the airplane experiences the minimum total drag. Now, have a look at our diagram here from the PHAC Chapter 5. Remember from earlier ground school training, parasite drag goes up as airspeed goes up, and induced drag goes up as airspeed goes down because of the higher angles of attack at slower airspeeds. So, by definition, any airspeed faster or slower than VG will shorten my gliding distance. So this minimum drag airspeed is our maximum glide distance airspeed because of minimum drag. Now, there are times when I am going to want this maximum distance glide airspeed, such as, let's say, I've experienced a total engine failure in my Cessna 172S over the Florida Everglades. Now, I'd rather glide to a field outside the swamp than spend the afternoon with the snakes and alligators. Okay, but what about if I'm in a position where I don't need the maximum glide distance of the VG airspeed, such as an engine failure in the traffic pattern, say on the downwind leg? Notice my maximum glide distance is not necessary here. I know I can make this runway. It's not like our example of being over the swamp where I definitely want to glide as far as possible. So the procedure is, opposite the spot of intended landing, we slow the aircraft to 80 knots, add 10 degrees of flaps, then we continue to gradually slow to VG and begin judging our glide path. Note, this first 10 degrees of flaps will change the wing camber only slightly and it will add more lift than drag. So here on the downwind, with airspeed at 80 knots and 10 degrees of flaps, now I want to call your attention to three important keys to this maneuver. Number one, turn to the base leg early. Number two, the wind. And number three, aiming point placement. So, starting with number one, the turn to base. Take a look at our diagram from the Epic Standardization Manual. No matter the wind, even in a light wind, you will begin your turn before the regular 45-degree point. And that brings us to the second key point to understand: wind. As you slow to VG, understand that in the Cessna 172S there are three engine out glide speeds, and any of these airspeeds must be adjusted for the wind. Number one, 70 is for flaps up. Number two, 68 is for propeller windmilling. Number three, 65 is for flaps down. So let's say that your propeller is windmilling, which will most likely be the case, and certainly will be the case in our simulated engine out with the engine at idle power. Now, adjust for 68 knots for the wind. Do this by adding half the wind speed for a headwind, or subtracting half the wind speed for a tailwind. And this will determine our aiming point placement, our third key to this maneuver. Now let's set up a real world example. Let's say that we are inbound to runway 29 right, and the current METAR for the wind shows 300 at 15 knots. So the winds are 10 degrees right of the nose at 15 knots. Now, even though they're not a direct headwind, let's start by adding 7 knots to our VG and adjust our glide from there. So I power back to idle, the propeller's windmilling at the low key point. That's the point opposite my spot of intended landing. I pitch to slow to 80 knots, add 10 degrees of flaps. Now, key number one, I'm going to plan my turn to base early, but I'm gauging the key point number two, wind. Now, I will gradually slow down to 75 knots. Why? Because that is my VG of 68 plus 7 knots, 7 being approximately half of my headwind. Now for key point number three, I have to plan my aiming point in order to plan my landing point. Folks, in this maneuver, we're going to use what we call the landing point technique. Please see the Epic Standardization Manual, page 46. Just a quick review. In the landing point technique, we are looking to set the tires down on a specific landing spot. So, in order to do this, we must move the aiming point back to account for aircraft float in ground effect. And so, how far back from the spot of landing should I move the aiming point? Well, of course, that depends on the wind. Have a look at our table here from the Epic Standardization Manual, page 116. This gives us an approximation to start with. So in our scenario, say I select the third runway stripe as my point of intended touchdown. And more specifically, using the landing point technique, I want to place my tires at the top of the third stripe. So, based on the winds and the chart that we just looked at, I'll move my aiming point back 200 feet for my Cessna 172S. Well, how far is that exactly? I can judge this easily from the air by remembering that a runway stripe is 120 feet long and the gap between stripes is 80 feet. So I will aim one stripe plus one gap back from the top of the third stripe. That's 200 feet. With these winds, that's going to get me pretty close. Remember, this is a judgment thing. Now, in addition, I'm happy with my landing point and my aiming point selection because it means that my roundout and flare to touchdown will take place over the runway. That is good decision making. Now, back to the Airplane Flying Handbook at the bottom of page 924 and our gliding airspeeds, both above and below VG. In our scenario, in our Cessna 172S with the propeller windmilling and our 15-knot headwind, starting at 80 knots and 10 degrees of flaps, let's have a look at our graphic. Our dash line here is VG, our lowest drag and longest glide. If we begin the maneuver on downwind at 80 knots, notice that we are at a higher airspeed. And the green arrow here shows us with a steeper glide angle. Why? We're above the VG speed, and so we have more parasite drag. Here is where we must be judging our glide angle. We do this by looking at the aiming point. With practice, you will be able to judge the aiming point from downwind or base leg and not just on the straight-in portion of the approach. If we're high, notice that a higher airspeed works in our favor by bringing us down steeper. As we gradually pitch up, we will decrease the airspeed and shallow the glide angle until we reach VG, our maximum glide of 75 knots. Remember, that's 68 plus 7 for our scenario headwinds. Now we see the green arrow is at the dash line, maximum distance. We know that we must continue to reduce the airspeed to our eventual landing speed, but we hold the VG for now and we see how this is affecting our glide path. As we continue toward landing, we start to pitch up and slow below VG, and now notice we are at a lower airspeed, and the green arrow here shows us again with a steeper glide angle. Why? We are now below VG, and so we have more induced drag. We can continue to adjust and steepen the glide path by pitching up and decreasing airspeed. However, we can't pitch up continuously, or we'll get to the critical angle of attack and stall the airplane. So here is where we open up our bag of tricks. Please take note of the second paragraph on page 925. And we see additional techniques to get the airplane down to the desired glide path to the aiming point. Now, your CFI will work with you in the airplane on these techniques. In addition to airspeed adjustments, we could, number one, add more flaps. Remember, at this point, you only have in the first 10 degrees. Number two, you can dogleg your base leg toward or away from the runway as needed. Number three, fly S-turns across your final approach course to use up some of that potential energy, otherwise known as altitude. And number four, learn the proper techniques of how to perform a forward slip. So, as we wrap up our study of this maneuver, I want you to notice a few things. We use VG adjusted for headwind or tailwind in the maneuver because it is the speed at which we fly with the least possible drag. However, we adjust our airspeed above and below VG based upon our proximity to our landing spot in order to adjust our glide path to our aiming point, and then ultimately to slow down to our proper touchdown speed. By adjusting the airspeed as needed, we give ourselves more kinetic energy options. We show that in this table comparing a single airspeed approach or fixed kinetic energy, called the VG technique, to the variable airspeed approach or variable kinetic energy, called the energy management technique. Notice in the VG technique, two of the three energy variables are fixed. Notice in the energy management technique, only one of the variables is fixed and two are variable, giving us more options. And finally, a few points to remember in the paragraphs concerning this maneuver from the Airplane Flying Handbook on page 927. It tells us in the fourth paragraph that initial flaps may be extended prior to the base key position. This is an effective practice in the Cessna 172S. Also, if you practice a lot at one airport or to a particular runway, as is the case for most of us, do not start using landmarks around or near your runway as markers for your turns or your key points. You'll want to be able to accurately judge your glide path without these crutches by using only the runway itself. And speaking of runways, remember how varying runway widths can cause the illusion of us either being high or low, as we show here. Another good reason to practice this maneuver at different airports. Remember, folks, practice is what helps you master this maneuver. Always be conscious of the wind, your position, and your aircraft's stick and rudder coordination. Practice this maneuver randomly throughout your training and your career to keep your glide path judgment sharp. And we'll see you next time.